Welcome everyone to our first virtual SPEP conference and our first virtual SPEP session. Very excited that it's the Contributions to Continental Philosophy session to honor the wonderful Eva Fieder-Kittay. And I'm going to turn things over right now to Shannon, who's our moderator.
Hi all. Do you all feel like you're back in a hybrid classroom and it's spring 2020? And we have to monitor 3 different monitors to be able to make this work. But we're so excited that you all are here to celebrate Eva and her contributions to continental philosophy. I will do some brief introductions and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. The order that we're going to go in today is hearing from our 3 speakers, and then Eva is going to give her response, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A, which I will moderate, and I'll tell you a little bit about before we get started. So our distinguished honoree today is Eva Fieder-Kittay. She's Distinguished Professor Emerita of Philosophy at Stony Brook University, where she also served as a Senior Fellow of the Stony Brook Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care and Bioethics, and as an affiliate of the Women's Studies Program. She's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEH Fellowship, and the APA and Phi Beta Kappa Leibowitz Prize. She also has been recognized for her work in feminist philosophy, being named Women Philosophy of the Year in 2003 and 2004 by the Society for Women in Philosophy, and having chaired the Committee on the Status of Women from 1997 to 2001. She's currently at work on a book project called Who's Truly Human? Personhood, Justice, and Dignity for the Cognitively Disabled. And when she's not working on that project, enjoying her retirement, she's contributing to a public dialogue on the ethics of care in the age of COVID by penning op-eds on COVID, care, and people with intellectual disabilities. She's the author most recently of Learning from My Daughter, The Value and Care of Disabled Minds, published in 2019 from Oxford. Her book that many of us know and love, Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality, and Dependency, has received international attention and has been translated into Japanese and Italian. Eva's other work includes Cognitive Disability and the Challenge to Moral Philosophy, Blackwell Guide to Feminist Philosophy, Theoretical Perspectives on Dependency in Women, Metaphor, Its Cognitive Force and Linguistic Structure, an edited collection, Frames, Fields, and Contrasts, and Women and Moral Theory. She's edited many journal issues in feminist philosophy and the philosophy of disability, and has published over 100 articles and book chapters. So she doesn't really rest. She's chaired and was a founder of Philosophy in an Inclusive Key Summer Institute, a summer program for undergraduates who are from groups underrepresented in philosophy. She's taught graduate and undergraduate courses in philosophy and has directed many dissertations in feminist philosophy, feminist ethics, social and political theory, metaphor, and disability studies, of which many of us here today were the beneficiaries of. Our first speaker today is Ellen Fieder. She's professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University. Her books include Family Bonds, Genealogies of Race and Gender, and Making Sense of Intersex, Changing Ethical Perspectives in Biomedicine. Ellen has noted that Eva's quiet influence is probably more evident in Ellen's second book than in her first. And it's really fair to say that Eva's course in feminist ethics from the early 90s, which I took in the aughts, remains a motivating force. In fact, Ellen's response today is focused on an essay that Eva wrote while Ellen was a graduate student called Ah, My Foolish Heart, a reply to Ellen Sobel's Antioch's Sexual Offense Policy, a philosophical exploration, where Ellen suggests that the value of Eva's work for those working in the continental tradition is first clear. Our second speaker today is Joel Michael Reynolds. He is an assistant professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University, a senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, a senior advisor at the Hastings Center, and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program. He's also the founder of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability, which he edits with Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke, and the founding co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Disability Ethics and Society book series from Oxford University Press, which he edits with Rosemary Garland Thompson. In his paper today, Joel will lay out a connection between Kittay's work and work on ethics and continental philosophy from Levinas forward, with a conceptual focus on the concepts of singularity, care, and recursion. And our third speaker today is Bonnie Mann. She is another one, along with Ellen and myself, of Eva's former PhD students. She is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon and co-editor-in-chief of Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. She's the author of 2 books from Oxford University Press, Women's Liberation and the Sublime, and Sovereign Masculinity, Gender Lessons from the War on Terror, as well as numerous articles and other texts. Today, she's going to be providing us with a Kittayan Arendtian analysis of the new authoritarianism in her paper on dependency, care, and aspirational fascism. So before we dive in, I'm just going to reiterate our structure. Each speaker is going to give their paper. Eva's going to reserve her response for all three to the end. So after Eva's response, we will open it up for Q&A, which I'll moderate. We should have approximately 25-ish minutes left for discussion at the end. And for all the panelists, I'm going to go ahead and give you a 5-minute warning around 25 minutes by direct messaging you when you're approaching that time. My instructions as a moderator for this virtual Zoom session are to keep an eye on the little Zoom hands during the Q&A and call on people to unmute themselves and share their question with us in the order in which the Zoom hands appeared. I've got 2 monitors here, so hopefully I'll be able to track everyone. If you're having trouble with accessing the raise hand feature, just message me in the chat and I'll add you to the Q&A list that way. So before I turn it over to Ellen, just take a moment to make sure that you are muted. And Ellen, I'm going to give it over to you.
Thank you so much. This is a really exciting occasion. I'm really glad to be a part of it. So characterizing the value of Eva Kittay's work to those of us trained in the Continental philosophical tradition may prove more straightforward than one might suppose. I confess that I've not yet read Eva's early investigation of metaphor, so I'll restrict my comments to the work with which I'm most familiar, specifically concerning feminist ethics, which has been her primary focus since the late 1980s. While she continued her work in the philosophy of language, she turned increasingly to exploring dimensions of the ethics of care, to focus on, especially with respect to those involved or cared for, and especially those with significant disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities, like her daughter Sesha, whose life has had a profound impact on her mother's thinking. I want to begin not with this work, but with another that I think provides readier insight into why Kittay's work may be appealing to those whose methods are grounded in the Continental tradition and not the Anglo-American tradition with which Kittay's work is identified. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 1995 exchange she had with Alan Sobel around the introduction of Antioch College's sexual offense policy. That was published in 1997. I introduce it here and beg your indulgence in doing so because I take it to be emblematic of the method she thematizes in her most recent book, Learning from My Daughter. Some of you may recall the attention Antioch's policy received after its introduction back in 1990. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, let me tell you that Antioch is a small college in Yellow Springs, Ohio, with a storied history that includes a long-time commitment to community governance. Following reports of a number of cases of date rape, a student group, Women of Antioch, proposed a new sexual offense policy to the faculty, administrators, and students who make up its community government. The policy was distinctive for its standard of explicit and ongoing consent between participants engaging in sexual activity. The controversy over the policy itself may seem anachronistic now. In a 2014 op-ed devoted to a California bill shifting the terms of consent from no means no to yes means yes, which is exactly what the Antioch policy spelled out, sociologist Michael Kimmel and activist Gloria Steinem get right to the point of the absurdity of the controversy over the shift. They ask, suppose someone you know slightly arrives at your home, baggage and all, and just barges in and stays overnight. When you protest, the response is, you didn't say no. Or imagine that a man breaks into your home while you sleep off a night of drunken revelry and robs you blind. Did your drinking imply consent? As I visit college campuses with a high school senior, who we hope will enroll at one of them next year, I'm seeing bulletin board postings replete with statements that closely reflect elements of Antioch's policy, emphasizing that consent to sexual activity is an ongoing process that must be made explicit. And of course, I'm kicking myself for not taking pictures and providing you a PowerPoint that would be more entertaining than watching my face, because we're all so bored of looking at each other's faces, but I'm sorry. For a generation entering college in the wake of Me Too, we might see how prescient the women of Antioch were in proposing the adoption of the policy to the student community 3 decades ago. While repeated reports of the date rape on Antioch's campus prompted the policy, national refusal to acknowledge the scope of the problem likely informed the sort of skepticism and even antipathy that print and radio news outlets reported following the policy's publication. That response might also have been owing to the normalization of what feminists called rape culture that, once more, might be harder to deny today. Indeed, when the New York Times reported on the first freshman orientation that covered the code, an incoming student was famously quoted as saying, well, if I have to ask the questions about whether it's okay to do these things with another person, I won't get what I want. Kittay's response to Alan Sobel did not have to reckon with that sort of failure of reasoning exhibited by the incoming freshman quoted in the Times. Sobel instead locates the flaws in Antioch's policy and its violation of principles such as autonomy. This in response to a female undergraduate who expressed her appreciation for the policy for clarifying that she has a say in sexual engagements. While Sobel does not precisely criticize the young woman for her ignorance, he faults Antioch for, and I quote, employing an anti-autonomy principle in its treatment of young adults that my college generation had fought to eliminate. But Sobel's objection on the basis of paternalism is overshadowed by his focus on the matter of consent, at the center of which is what I can only describe as a weird turn toward what he characterizes as the policy's rejection of the Pauline marriage contract. Sobel explains that Pauline marriage entails, and I quote, consent at the very beginning in advance to a whole series of sexual acts that might comprise the rest of one's sexual life. Consent to sex is presumed after the exchange of vows and rings. Each spouse owns the body and sexual powers of the other, and so marital rape is conceptually impossible, replaced by a notion of fulfilling the marriage debt. On Sobel's reading, Antioch has somehow undermined the notion of consent by robbing it, and I quote, of its ability to apply to an indefinite, open future. It furthermore undermines or maybe distorts the notion of consent, he claims, by refusing to acknowledge its binding nature. Turning away from Pauline marriage and addressing the sort of consent an undergraduate might give in the case of a hookup, he supposes that once given, withdrawing consent is prima facie wrong. Sobel's characterization of sexual engagement in contractual terms may strike us as prima facie wrong. His invocation of Pauline marriage in the context of sexual consent on a college campus misplaced, and therefore not worth further reflection. To her credit, Eva responds directly and clearly to the points where Sobel seems to get just about everything about Antioch's code wrong, starting with his treatment of the code outside of the contexts which motivated it and where it applies, which Kittay points out does not encompass long-term marriages or relationships, Pauline or otherwise. And while Kittay allows that there's something blameworthy about being a tease, and as I wrote that, I was wondering if anyone still says that today. It is certainly the case that if sexual contact is not desired, then allowing it to continue constitutes the making of oneself, as Kittay puts it, a sexual object and not a sexual agent. Sobel also reads the code less carefully than he ought, missing details about the nature of the expression of consent, which opened the way to making the code appear absurdly challenging, evidently passion suppressing, and finally ludicrous. So I dwell on Sobel's philosophical exploration. This is the title of his work, because the contrast between his approach and Eva's response to it may help us appreciate why Eva's work would be featured at a panel at SPEP. Sobel's arguments are advanced as answers to what he figures inaccurately, as Kittay carefully demonstrates, are the failings of Antioch's code. While at moments he sympathetically gestures toward the historical and structural imbalances that might motivate its proposal, he ultimately throws up his hands at such challenges, focusing instead on drawing conclusions with respect to the violation of abstract principles or general concepts. Details be damned. So to illustrate this contrast that I'm trying to underscore here, let's see where Kittay begins her response. A sexual code, she writes, occupies an uneasy position at the intersection of the public and private, the communal and intimate, the codifiable and spontaneous, the articulate and ineffable. And sexual conduct is located at the troubling interface of pleasure and offense, passion and power, freedom and submission, desire as an individual desire as an individual drive, and desire as the epiphany of mutuality, the desiring of the other's desire. What is already clear is that the ground of Kittay's analysis begins not with a preoccupation with applying principles like consent that might already seem to be settled, nor is she focused on disputing the validity of Sobel's application to what are presented as obvious and shared and also apparently settled understandings of sexual engagement between men and women, with its limitations, men's occasional callousness, as Sobel puts it, or the presumption of women's disingenuous resistance, saying no when meaning yes. Instead, Kittay directs us immediately to reflect on how complicated and varied a terrain we embark upon in really thinking about sexual engagement in the social conditions in which we live. She compellingly articulates the unsuitability of applying the terms of contract to this, and indeed many intimate domains. If, as Sobel says, Antioch cuts back on a traditional power of consent, its ability to apply to an indefinite open future, she proposes that that is just right when it comes to matters of sexual desire. A Pauline marriage, after all, makes marital rape an oxymoron, and any woman who has been raped by her husband will tell you that there is nothing oxymoronic about her trauma. From the opening onward, her response clarifies that the problems posed by Antioch's code are more fraught, but, or perhaps for this reason, more interesting than a straightforward application of principles or concepts can accommodate. In fairness, I think that Sobel's essay signals at moments his awareness of its limitations, but lacking the tools necessary to reckon with the challenges. The essay ends up concealing the questions that the code raises, rather than forthrightly acknowledging and reckoning with them. So I've been trying to think of some helpful metaphor to capture the incongruity of Sobel's response. And maybe someone can do better than I can. It's sort of like when some guy shows up, some repair guy shows up to repair an appliance, and the control panel is behind like a shield that's set with hex screws, but he's only brought a plumbing wrench, so he doesn't have Allen wrenches, and it's like he can't even see the hex screws. So he says, well, it can't be fixed. So the image is not great, but I'm hoping you get the sense of what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to say that Sobel can't really see the situation accurately and therefore cannot assess the code's response to it in a way that gives us an accurate portrayal of either. So turning now to Eva's most recent work, it struck me that it might be helpful to see what Susan Bryson damningly characterizes as the willful ignorance of philosophers who devalue the lives of individuals with significant cognitive disabilities as owing to a similar lack of tools. If, as Bryson writes, the ignorance that motivates judgments about the lack of moral worth, I think it's owing to some philosophers' presumption in the completeness of their toolbox. What else could explain their failure to take any interest in the lives such people actually live? If philosophers have at their disposal all they need to answer any question they might entertain, then there is no call to entertain any doubt in their approach, even when such an approach denies empirical evidence to the contrary. Evidence, after all, tends to smear the clear lines laid by a kind of logical thinking that occupies the idealized worlds in which many philosophers appear to feel most at home, and furthermore believe is the proper space to engage in philosophy. These worlds, Kittay writes, have little room for disability and virtually none for cognitive as opposed to physical disability. Philosophers give the subject even less attention than some of the differences among persons that today take central stage in the academy: sexual, gender, and racial ethnic differences. The disabled individual, if she was mentioned at all in the philosophical literature, was invoked as the exception, as the infant that was to be abandoned, the changeling who is scarcely human, and most recently as the marginal human who moves us to ask about the moral status of non-human animals. In short, as the exception that proves whatever rule the philosopher hopes to instantiate. It may be obvious that idealized worlds are not, in short, populated with flesh and blood human beings. But here is one of the critical lessons that animates Kittay's response to Sobel and that she herself emphasizes in Learning from My Daughter. Her reflections on writing from the personal voice, a tradition associated with the philosophy's origins and repeated through the early modern period, underscore an important difference between her work and those whose work has no room to consider the flawed and wondrous lives of embodied subjects who live in actual worlds with other subjects who come with their own particularity, their own always situated thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and of course, desires. Where, in short, the sorts of philosophers who transport human problems to ideal worlds so as to more efficiently draw or maybe to distill clear solutions that no longer address the messy problems that inspired them, Kittay recognizes the inadequacy of prevailing philosophical concepts to address, and I quote, questions about our moral obligations and our social and political commitments. That is, central philosophical questions, and turns to the personal and autobiographical as a ground without apology. Perhaps it is by now clear why I began these reflections with Kittay's response to Alan Sobel, the title of which is, "Ah, My Foolish Heart." The inadequacy of Sobel's response is so much starker in contrast to Kittay's invocation of the leanings of her own heart, which she claimed were actually initially aligned with Sobel's reasoning. And yet, when she brought that initial response into reflection on the details of Antioch's policy and its specific context, and then once more, her own lived experience and that of others, she offers both a closer reading of the policy and a vividly rendered counter-argument that puts her and an imagined romantic partner at the center. In response to Sobel's grim summary of the code that he claims requires in all cases a verbal assent to sexual activity, she identifies, quote, an antecedent clause that implies, on the contrary, that verbal consent is not always demanded if sexual contact and or conduct is not mutually and simultaneously initiated. So, she concludes, if my partner and I are seized with a desire to kiss, we don't need to say a thing as our mouths spontaneously move toward each other. And if I am as passionately unbuttoning my partner and my partner unbuttons me, we can both remain undisturbed in our inarticulate bliss. The points of reflection where her foolish heart may lead then are not cast aside in favor of the conclusions born of Sobel's wisdom, and that's Kittay's term, but figure centrally in her counter-argument. What I want to highlight then is the continuity between important features of this earlier presentation and her most recent book. And of course, this approach also forms a central insight of the argument for what would eventually appear in Love's Labor, and that, she tells us, will figure in her forthcoming volume. So this is how she puts it in Love's Labor. My mother has been serving us dinner. My father and I are nearly finished eating. She alone remains unfed. A sigh announces the completion of her task and the beginning of a well-deserved respite. She sits down to eat. With a shrug and a smile, and with a touch of ironic humor, she says, after all, I'm also a mother's child. In Love's Labor, Kittay recounts her confusion about her mother's explanation for why, after all, she could sit down and eat too. One imagines the child thinking with her father, why didn't she just sit down and join them at the beginning of the meal? Why did she need any sort of justification for enjoying the dinner she made? Even if Kittay's confusion would persist long after, the adult philosopher saw in her mother's words a claim to equality. It would not look like familiar claims in political theory, nor in existing feminist reformulations of this equality. This would not be a claim that begins in an individual agent, for example, in identifying rationality as a source of equality, but resides instead in the fact that we require and are furthermore entitled to care as a function of human dependency. I don't think that the full impact of this shift in the ground of a basis for equality and justice that Kittay has laid out has really been absorbed or genuinely felt in a field that continues to be dominated by ideal theory. Her work, as well as others in feminist ethics, continues to function as a kind of critical discourse in the field, and we know where those belong on our syllabi. But we can hope that the project of Love's Labor, its extension to Learning from My Daughter, and the subsequent volume planned, Who's Truly Human? Justice, Personhood, and Mental Disability, will mean that Eva's work will come to be understood to mark a paradigm shift within our own discipline that sees the need for a much better equipped toolbox, not only to recognize and so better repair what is broken, but to build the sorts of understanding. So
There we go. Is it showing that it's recording again?
Now it's recording, yeah.
I'm not sure why that happened. Okay.
All right, I'll get rolling. First of all, if anyone would like to follow along by reading, I'm gonna drop a hyperlink in the chat that should allow you to read the piece as I'm speaking, if that would be easier. Let me just make sure I've got that set so anyone with the link can read it. Right, if that first link, if that first one doesn't work, there we go. Now I said it, now it's in the chat. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I'm just absolutely delighted to be a part of this. Eva's work has had a bigger impact on my life, personally and professionally than almost anyone else's. So it's just a real honor to be here. I also want to give a big shout out to all the labor that's been done to put this on, especially the work of Katie Creasy. This is just an astonishing, astonishing undertaking, and I'm really grateful for all the work that's been done. And I also want to give a shout out to the Emory Disability Studies Initiative, because I really first got to know Eva a little bit better in the spring of 2015. I was the program manager assistant of the DSI, and Rosemary Garland Thompson and Ben were like, well, who do you want to bring? And I'm like, can we bring out Eva Kittay? And Eva got to come out for a few days and we got to spend time together. And that was really transformative. I was in the middle of writing my dissertation. So many thanks to Emory for making that possible. All right, I'll jump in. This is a bit meandering. You can tell I couldn't make up my mind if I wanted this to be a standard paper or a bit more personal, and so I kind of do both. So here we go. There are many philosophical problems that could be redescribed as obsessions. And the problem of beginning is, I think, one of these. Whether Aristotle's prime mover, Spinoza's Deus sive natura, God or nature, or Hegel's Geist, thinkers who otherwise disagree on many different things find it crucial, even necessary, to determine not simply where to begin or how to begin, but to determine the place that beginning itself has relative to philosophy. But beginning, and thinking about beginning philosophically as well as philosophical beginnings, is a strange and difficult task. Whether Aristotle or Zhuangzi, whether Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Midgley, Jung, many figures across both continental and Anglo-analytic philosophy are obsessed with beginning. And crucially, many, though not all, understand beginning in a fundamentally Greek way, namely in terms of an arche, as that which is both an origin and a foundation, as that which is definitively first, is primary, but at the same time a ground and a source. And of course, when deployed in this sense, for those who like dorking out on etymology, right, arche is typically translated into Latin as principium, a term that mirrors that duality by invoking the sense of both a principle, P-L-E, and a principal, P-A-L. Assuming that in order to philosophize, one must address the problem of beginning, then many questions arise. How, where, why? What authorizes beginning to think by looking to, say, common sense or to tradition? What authorizes beginning to think by looking to, say, bracketed introspection or the results of modern scientific method, or perhaps even to revelation? I want to suggest today that one of Eva Kittay's central contributions to continental philosophy, though in some sense also to other areas of philosophy, is to found a new beginning, namely that of care, which is to always say care for others. So I take it as part of my task today to explore Kittay's attempts at this beginning, and hopefully to also gain some insight concerning what it means for us, for each of us, to begin with and from care. To begin, that is to say, to care better, and justly so, to just care better. Heidegger, following insights that were very obviously extant in multiple ancient Mesopotamian traditions, among other spots, Heidegger famously argued that humans, whatever else we are beings defined by care, by caring for a panoply of things. And that term, as those who are familiar with German know, the term he used to make that argument in his early writings, Sorge, picks out a profoundly wide range of caring relations, including sorrow, worry, labors, making arrangements, even fending for one another. Caring is hard and messy and integral to being human. And philosophy, to be sure, is by no means a necessarily caring endeavor. Yet Heidegger argues that care defines us not because we choose to care in this or that way, and not because we succeed or fail to care in this or that circumstance, but because we are claimed by care. We find ourselves already in the world amidst a dizzying swirl of concernful dealings. I come from a family in the respect I'm about to articulate, similar to Kittay's, that survived only by developing, refining, and fighting for caring systems. My disabilities and those of my family members threatened our well-being more often than not for societal reasons. They were threats because society is fundamentally structured for an ideal, able body and the cares that surround it. And because society discriminates against and oppresses in all sorts of ways non-normate bodies that more often than not are not part of the framework when cares and caring systems are thought about. We were, for example, constantly aware that Jason's life, my brother Jason's life, could hang in the balance at the whim of a health insurance agency, of a political representative, of one or a few state or federal judges, of an overworked healthcare provider, of a sudden personal financial emergency, or for that matter, by the loss or even just temporary sickness of anyone on our kind of core caring team. The success or failure of our caring system and the quality of the lived experience of each individual in it fatefully turned on whether caring systems above and beyond our own, cared for us as well. Kittay's work, and I'm taking a very broad bird's eye view here, from love's labor up to learning from my daughter, up to, I almost cited a piece that hasn't come out yet, but I thought that wouldn't be fair. Kittay's work demonstrates in many different ways that the meaning of disability, whatever it is, cannot be determined simply by reference to bodies or to environments, but instead only in terms of the interaction and interanimation of each relative to caring systems. We build worlds that care or fail to care, and the moral weight of those decisions falls neither on fate nor circumstance, but on us. Looking at the political debates raging in the 1990s through right up to today, speaking of the infrastructure bill, the bigger version of which still has not been passed by resolution or by budget resolution, the lack of political representation for lives like Jason's and lives like Sasha's, and families like mine and families like Kittay's, and the lack of political representation for systems like those that our families built and also relied upon. It's staggering. This is not, of course, to diminish the spectacular achievements of disability rights activists over the last half of the 20th century. But anti-discrimination laws like the ADA in the US, the DDA in the UK, etc., are in many ways the very thinnest of institutional supports. They are targeted at fixing issues after they have happened. And they categorically fail. Even the ADA categorically fails to extend to cultural and political representation in broader ways that, say, a constitutional approach would. And I'm thinking there especially of Marta Russell's really important critiques of the ADA, despite working to get it passed, some of her writings in the 1990s. Being able to sue for something, in other words, is not the same as having basic supports to live one's life. It's not the same as a real social net, and especially when one is caring for one that requires 24-hour care and whose care requires things surrounding basic needs. This is all to say, I don't think it's hyperbole to claim that the current US political system is actively oriented against caring systems like these. Our care for each other has been carried out, in other words, in environments ultimately hostile to our existence as caring beings. And it is this lived experience that led me to be so taken in by Kittay's insistence across her body of work that the beginning of our life together, which is always to say and always to include our moral life, is one defined not by the abilities or capacities we have, but by our relations to one another. It is this lived experience that led me to be so taken in by Kittay's insistence, in other words, across her body of work, that the beginning of our life together is one defined not by the algorithms we devise to judge various facets of existence, but by the facts of our being together, the bonds and the ties that constitute our ever-shared world. When I first encountered Eva's work, this new moral beginning hit me very hard. It was salvific, in fact, for it countered an intellectual milieu that, as far as I could tell, really had no place for people like my brother Jason. I was, and still am, ready to fight in the real world for a place for people like him, if reasons fail to suffice. But Eva showed me that the reasons were there. They were there for those who had ears to hear, to invoke a decidedly prophetic biblical phrase. To get a sense for what I mean and the impact that what I'm calling Eva's beginning, this beginning of care had for me, I want to read a somewhat long exchange that Kittay famously includes in her 2009 essay, "The Personal is Philosophical is Political, a philosopher and mother of a cognitively disabled person sends notes from the battlefield." This exchange, as I assume many people in this virtual session today know, occurred during a conference on September 20th in 2008 at Stony Brook University that included Eva Kittay, Peter Singer, Jeff McMahon, etc. This exchange definitely requires a trigger warning regarding ableism and other things. But I do think reading through this is important. So this is Peter Singer directing a question at Eva Kittay. He says, you've said a couple times, and you said it just again in response to the last question, that you think Jeff McMahon doesn't have the empirical stuff right with respect to my comparison between humans and non-human animals. Well, this is again Peter Singer. Well, Peter Singer continues, can you tell us some of these morally significant psychological capacities in which you think that human beings, and let's talk about real ones, so the ones who are quote unquote profoundly mentally retarded, in which they are superior to pigs or dogs or animals of that sort? And it says in parentheses there, Eva Kittay responds by shaking her head. He continues, it's a factual question. You can't just shake your head. You have to put up or stop saying that. Eva Kittay responds, Peter, you asked me, how is Sasha different from what did you say, a pig? And when I shook my head, you said, well, it's a factual question. Put up or shut up. The first thing I have to do, again, this is Eva, the first thing I have to do, Peter, when you ask me that question is I have to get over a feeling of nausea. It's not that I'm not able to answer it intellectually, it's that I can't even get to the point emotionally where I can answer that question. And it says in parentheses, pause. I don't know how long that pause was. I assume it was at least a few seconds. Eva continues, most of the time. When I say you can't just wave your hand and say so on, it's because there's so much to being human. There's the touch, there's the feel, there's the hug, there's the smile. There are so many ways of interacting, and I don't think you need philosophy for this. This is why I just reject the idea that you should base moral standing on a list of cognitive capacities or psychological capacities or any kind of capacities. Because what it is to be human is not a bundle of capacities. It's a way that you are. It's a way that you are in the world, a way you are with another. And I could adore my pig or dog or fill in the blank. I could dote on my pig. It would be something, though, entirely different. And if you can't get that, Peter Singer, if you can't understand that, then I'm not sure exactly what it is you want to hear from me that I could tell you. But I'll keep trying because I think this is a very important point. End quote. As articulated by Kittay, one core tenet of care ethics is that in order to count as care, care must be received as such by the person being cared for. Call this, just for shorthand, the real care principle. Note that this is a significantly different standard than one based upon, say, preserving autonomy, or one based upon, say, minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure. And it makes the question of, it in some ways subjugates the questions of the capacities, the particular capacities, the bundles of capacities of a person, to how they actually find themselves in relation to another. In her 2019 monograph, Learning from My Daughter, Kittay clarifies in some way or argues that a distinction should be made between care, lowercase, and care, uppercase. That lowercase term, this is easier to see visually, but I'll just say lowercase and uppercase to keep the distinction clear. The lowercase care refers to its everyday use, right? Care is a discrete act, a practice, some type of labor. But care in the uppercase, all caps, it refers to care in what she calls the fully normative sense, care as it ought to be practiced if it is to do what care is supposed to do. Care, uppercase, she further clarifies, is grounded in the flourishing of all parties, carer and cared for alike, and is commensurate with the flourishing of others outside the caring relation. I think this is a very new beginning, a new moral beginning relative to the history of certainly the Western intellectual tradition. This beginning places care, uppercase, as a fundamentally communitarian ideal, one which holds not simply equality or egalitarianism as a value, but equity between people as central, and which invariably relies upon and forces us to focus upon sharing resources to achieve that goal of caring for. Care ethics, then, one could say, is care ethics, all caps. And as Kittay lays it out, it offers, I think, a fundamental challenge to those who would put right before good, or happiness before justice, and capacities before caring relations, and who would ever place concerns of the individual before that of relationships. Kittayan care ethics, in other words, I think places a much higher demand on the type and scope of deliberation a moral agent must undertake. And, you know, I feel that demand part of the reason I wanted to read that whole quote is I feel like you can almost viscerally feel that demand failing to be met by Peter and Jeff, whether one focuses on the empirical stuff that they ignore, or one focuses on the moral and emotional dimensions that they also actively ignore. So let me jump back to that sentence again. Kittayan care ethics places a much higher demand on the type and scope of deliberation a moral agent must undertake, and the reflection they also must undertake upon the principles that underwrite such deliberation in the first place, and especially if those principles are thought of as beginnings. And I'll just add a little zinger here that I was saying something about Kittay in a talk a while ago, and someone's like, yeah, you know, it's weird. People complain about particularism, but it's almost like we're all born into particularism. And when that's used as a way to kind of insult some of or to take down some of the insights from care ethics, it seems like someone has to ignore how they actually live their lives. I thought that was a great response. There was someone, I can't remember who said it to me, but that wasn't my idea. Anyway, all begin life as particularists. All begin life in the throes of individual and individualized care, and all begin life and live life and move through life necessarily through a matrix of caring relationships and systems. In some ways, Gail Weiss just entered the waiting room. I feel like I should admit her in.
I got her already.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, Gail. Gail's back. In some ways, the existential truth gives the lie to those who argue for other beginnings, whether those other beginnings begin behind a veil, whether those other beginnings are approached through hedonic calculation, or whether those other beginnings are of the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. And let me digress for just one more minute by contrasting beginning with care and, let's say, beginning behind a veil. One of the features of theoretical work under a Rawlsian framework, though of course, by no means only Rawls who has this kind of approach, I'll just say an ideal theory framework, is the movement from positive claims under certain abstract constraints to rules. The output of the framework, right, however modified, is to apply to the domain in question, full stop. And what I find exceptionally powerful about Kittay's critique of Rawls lies not only in the substantive pushback against various considerations in and relative to such a social framework, but in the methodological role given to what I'm just going to call now, to borrow a dorky term from computer science, recursion. And I think this is actually a non-ideal concept par excellence. What do I mean by this? The exit condition for care, the only way we can say that care has been done, is always indexed to a situation or a context of care, right? On Kittay's version of care ethics, as I read it, discrete situations and contexts of care can only be understood further in terms of their place in a larger social-political context. So even when a particular caring action, let's say, completes itself, it's taken up as care by the cared for, that event, that scene of care must now be placed back into and must be understood relative to a larger caring context of caring actions and caring systems writ large. And this, I think, is precisely the formula for a vision of justice wherein care is not a sometimes outcome, but a beginning. It's an origin and a foundation. A vision of justice, in other words, wherein care is not a mere goal or ideal, but it's a principle, and it's the principle, P-A-L, principle. The concept of recursion that I'm suggesting is always at play, I think, in Kittay's work. And that's also why I somewhat, I titled this with a kind of play on words, Just Care Better, right? There's something profound and yet disturbing about that comparative better. And when taken seriously inside of, I think, any moral framework, better haunts action. It haunts moral confidence. It can haunt any number of ethical, social, and political considerations, partially because it always must place things back into a larger context, and it always must return again to beginning with care. It's never done. Let me make this even more concrete. Again, sorry for the dorky computer science term, but I couldn't think of a better concept to make this point. Instead of allowing my brother to be placed in a medical facility where the level of care he would have required would have almost inevitably been unmet, leading to his end, our family compensated for the lack of social support from our state and federal government by devoting our own time and our own bodies to his care, as did in crucial moments extended family members and sometimes even community members. But even if we had had all of the support we needed, caring for Jason would not and could not stop at caring for him. That is not an end. That is not a goal inside of, relative to understanding care, all caps, as a beginning. It would have included, as care wouldn't, even if we'd had all that support, caring for Jason would not and could not stop at caring for him. It would have included also caring for Sesha and supporting all the caring networks that sustained her and Jason and continue to sustain so many like them, and for that matter, so many unlike them in various ways. Like a fractal, then, to begin with care means to ever continue in the process of caring for others and supporting caring systems. An infinite process in principle, because care is never complete. It is a beginning which always already asks us to begin again. I'd like to close by returning to a claim from Eva that has in many ways been my North Star, both philosophically and also personally. What it is to be a human is not a bundle of capacities. It's a way that you are, a way you are in the world, a way you are with another. To return to the animating question of philosophy's beginnings that I began with, what authorizes beginning to think by centering and practicing care for others? Well, that is how we are when we act as we are, inevitably, nestedly, interdependent, interconnected, and interanimating beings. As Merleau-Ponty writes in the concluding sections of Phenomenology of Perception, quote, I am a psychological and historical structure and have received with existence a manner of existing, a style. All my actions and thoughts stand in relationship to this structure, and even a philosopher's thought is merely a way of making explicit their hold on the world and what they are. The beginning that Kittay's body of work puts forward is one which is honest about the relationship we have to the structure of the world and to others. And I'm so grateful for the way she has made philosophically explicit her hold on the world through her love and care for her family, and in particular, her love and care for Sesha. To begin with care is to begin with the caring relations without which we could not be at all. So if we are to philosophize about the meaning of being human, of morality, of sociality, of the political, of justice, even of the divine, let us, to invoke the concluding line of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, let us discuss this then, again, starting from the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. You know, we need an applause track at these virtual conferences. All we have are those little hands that we can put up on our Zoom screens. But thank you, Joel. Bonnie, you're up next. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute, and I will spotlight you.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. And thank you all for these papers, and thank you, Gail, for the invitation. I found myself struggling, as Joel did, between sort of personal tribute to Eva and all the things she's meant in my life and all the things she's done for me, and more rigorous philosophical paper. In the end, length made the decision. I had to cut 1,500 words from what I had written. So I am doing the more rigorous philosophical version, but hopefully my personal gratitude and devotion to Eva shines through. Hannah Arendt's account of the harms of fascism turns on the degree to which it involves an attempt to alter various aspects of the human condition. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt says totalitarian systems attempt to alter human nature. Later, she disavows the notion of human nature and speaks instead of the human condition. Eva Kittay, I will argue, understands the human condition better than Arendt, because she recognizes the dependency relation that underwrites it. Eva's account of dependency as an inevitable and ubiquitous feature of the human condition allows us to recognize how aspirational fascism today turns on an authoritarian and masculinist relation to the dependency condition. So I want to ask what sort of reorientation Eva's work in conversation with Arendt might affect in our understanding of and resistance to contemporary authoritarianism. I claim that Eva's call for a public ethic of care offers a counter rationality to the neoliberal rationality that fuels the rise of what Bengiat calls the new authoritarianism, and she dates that after 1990. In Arendt's words, Eva's public ethic of care helps us to both examine and bear, quote, consciously the burden which our century has placed on us. So section 1 of this paper is entitled A Kittayan Revision of Arendt's Account of the Human Condition, particularly of the conditions of natality, plurality, and worldliness. So in the human condition, Arendt describes 6 conditions for human existence: life, natality, mortality, worldliness, plurality, and the earth. From Arendt's list of conditions, there are 3 that are particularly important to her analysis of totalitarianism. Those are natality, worldliness, and plurality. So let's begin as human existence begins with natality. Arendt resists Heidegger's fixation on being toward death by emphasizing birth. All of the big themes of the human condition are connected with natality. Labor and work, she writes, as well as action, are rooted in natality, insofar as they have the task to provide and preserve the world for the constant influx of newcomers who are born into the world as strangers. However, Arendt continues, of the 3, action has the closest connection to the human condition of natality. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting. The condition of natality is the condition that Arendt identifies with human freedom then. She writes, the principle of freedom was created when man was created. It is natality that allows us to do the unexpected, to bring about something completely new. But when Arendt refers to the birth of new men and the new beginning, to the action they are capable of by virtue of being born, she adopts wholesale the incoherent ideal at the base of the masculinist fictions that have underwritten the Western political tradition. What is astoundingly obvious to anyone who has ever met a newly born human is that no one is capable of any action whatsoever by virtue of being born. Humans at birth are neither homo politicus nor homo economicus, but rather inops infantis, helpless babies. Why, you're nothing but a little grub, I found myself cooing with both adoration and surprise to my grandson Liam on the night of his birth. Eva's description of the human condition calls on us to attend philosophically to the reality that an infant will not survive or thrive without another who meets her basic needs. The miracle of birth brings with it the inescapable fact of human dependency, and the work that must be done if that newly arrived one is even to survive. Those who are able to act in the Arendtian sense are enabled by care. If the promise of natality is freedom, and this is the foundation of politics itself, it's only realized through the labor of care. This means that the human condition of natality is already the human condition of dependency. And if natality is, as Arendt claims, the miracle that saves the world, the newcomer has to have a world to act in. This is the dimension of the human condition. Okay, when I get little messages saying my internet connection is unstable, I'm going to stop speaking until that message goes away. So hopefully everyone can follow. So the newcomer must have a world to act in. This is the dimension of the human condition Arendt calls worldliness. She writes, the world and the things of the world constitute the condition under which this specifically human life can be at home on the earth. The human world is made up of things, objects, buildings, streets, which, quote, have the function of stabilizing human life. Human existence would be impossible without things, and things would be a heap of unrelated articles, a non-world, if they were not the conditioners of human existence, Arendt tells us. And what she calls common sense, that sixth sense, which makes life with others possible, is constituted in part by our relationship to a world of objects. It exists only insofar as people are related to the same chair and the same table, as she puts it. Homo faber, the human maker, builds a world for inops infantis to be born into and to depart from, while inops infantis becomes Homo faber only through care. The dependency condition is paramount in worldliness in two ways beyond this basic relation between Homo faber and inops infantis. First, in order to learn to perceive and use a world of objects, I must have another person to look at the world with me, to point things out, and to respond when I point things out to them. The developmental importance of joint attention or shared attention has been widely studied in empirical sciences, along with its role in enabling social cognition. This dependency does not end in infancy, but is a constant feature of the human condition of worldliness. In another context, Lisa Gunther writes, quote, the testimony of survivors of solitary confinement suggests that if one is deprived for long enough of the experience of other concrete persons in a shared or common space, it is possible for one's own sense of personhood to diminish or even collapse. Without the concrete experience of other embodied egos, oriented toward common objects in a shared world, my own experience of the boundaries of those perceptual objects begins to waver. So the object world itself is destabilized, and I'm destabilized along with it. This means it's not only that the world makes possible the common sense that keeps me in relation with others. Both of us see the same chair, sit around the same table. Bonnie Honeck calls this our thing dependency. Others also keep me in relation to that world. And they do that by stabilizing the world for me. Their absence heralds the end of the common world. The dependency condition then is the condition out of which I develop my capacity for shared attention. And intersubjective dependency structures the very stability of the world itself. Arendt fails to give a full account of the dependency condition as the fundamental structure of worldliness. But Eva trains us to notice the operation of that condition everywhere. So now let's turn briefly to the human condition of plurality. That is the reality that we're born into a world of other persons, that we're irreducible to one another, that a plurality of perspectives comes into play whenever we are together. This is where Arendt comes closest to recognizing the dependency condition. Now, by plurality, she means the ways, quote, we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live. This uniqueness is a key feature of human plurality, and plurality for Arendt is the condition sine qua non for that space of appearance, which is the public realm. Hence, she writes, the attempt to do away with plurality is always tantamount to the abolition of the public realm itself. And this is why plurality is a fundamental condition for all political life. The reality of the public realm relies on the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives and aspects in which the common world presents itself, she writes, for though the common world is the common meeting ground of all, those who are present have different locations in it. Being seen and being heard by others derive their significance from the fact that everybody sees and hears from a different position. And this is the meaning of all public life. So natality and its promise, which is freedom, worldliness and its promise, which is common sense, and plurality and its promise, which is politics, are all structured by and as dependence. What Arendt neglects to do is to make explicit the dependency condition that underlies all three. Eva provides a rigorous and robust account of the dependency condition. She describes that dependency relation as a complex power relation in which vulnerability, the capacity to meet vulnerability with care, the capacity to meet vulnerability with care and the consequent vulnerability of the one providing care open out in a ripple effect that links the micropolitics of everyday life to the macropolitics of global economic justice. So section 2 is entitled Arendt's Analysis of Totalitarianism as the Destruction of the Human Conditions of Natality, Plurality, and Worldliness, and how the Kittayan revision of this account enhances that analysis. So in Arendt's study of totalitarianism, as she struggles to name the distinct evil of totalitarian rule, she comes back again and again to the notion that fascism amounts to an assault on what she called then human nature and later calls the human condition. What totalitarian ideologies aim at is the transformation of human nature itself, she writes. The concentration camps are the laboratories where changes in human nature are tested. And this endeavor takes the form of denying people the conditions of natality, worldliness, and plurality. The human condition of natality is undone when the fascist regime engages in the ghastly experiment of eliminating human spontaneity itself as an expression of human behavior. The totalitarian regime aligns itself with a supposedly inevitable movement of history or of nature. The quote, chief aim is to make it possible for the force of nature or of history to race freely through mankind unhindered by any spontaneous human action. And terror is the fascist tool. Terror, Arendt writes, has to eliminate not only freedom, but the source of freedom, which is given with the fact of the birth of man and resides in his capacity to make a new beginning. So terror homogenizes individual persons into a mass of indistinct human material. Spontaneity is liquidated when the meaning of any gesture of uniqueness, any surprising or unexpected act is preempted. Even choosing to die the death of a martyr is impossible when any such act results in the punishment by death of those who have not themselves chosen to act. So our Kittayan revision of Arendt leads us to note that overt terror is actually unnecessary. And indeed, the new authoritarianism does not need the most extreme forms of terror. One can eliminate the promise of human freedom by simply eliminating the possibility of care. If the dependency condition is dishonored, if people are denied the capacity for and conditions for care, the promise of natality is already undone. So now let's turn to the human condition of worldliness, which is undone, beginning with the mass loneliness that sets the stage for the rise of fascism in Arendt's account. The secret societies that flourish in this period provide a sense of belonging to those who feel cast off and set adrift. These societies have, as Arendt puts it, an unsurpassed capacity to establish and safeguard a fictitious world through consistent lying. The force of totalitarian propaganda, she says, lies in its ability to shut the masses off from the factual world, or in recently familiar terms, its power to welcome them into an unworld of alternative facts. The hold of this alternate reality is intensified to the point that individual experience has no power against it. So one can apparently be dying of COVID and continue to believe fervently that COVID is a hoax, that the COVID vaccine is a human microchip program, things like the hospital, the ventilator, the refrigerator truck there to hold the extra bodies, and experiences, the pain, the labored breathing, the loss of one's sense of smell, lose their power to link us to a common reality. Our Kittayan revision of Arendt helps us to recognize that facts, however often or vehemently reiterated, provide no antidote to worldlessness. Only through restoring the conditions of care can we once again experience a common world. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. So the human condition of plurality is undone, Arendt says, by pressing men against each other so that the space between them is destroyed. She refers to the iron band of terror, which destroys the plurality of men and makes out of the many one who unfailingly will act as if he himself were part of the course of history or of nature. Arendt points to the fascist strategy of turning a plurality of humans into a mass of human material. All distinction between individuals is lost. On the other hand, plurality is destroyed literally when the authoritarian leader or movement expels or exterminates those who fall. So let me start that sentence again. On the other hand, plurality is destroyed literally when the authoritarian leader or movement expels or exterminates those who fall outside the boundaries of racial or ethnic homogeneity, when they claim an entitlement to decide who can and who cannot inhabit the earth. Ultimately, Arendt suggests that the fundamental belief of totalitarianism is that everything is possible, meaning that human finitude can be overcome, at least by the people chosen by history or nature to carry the movement forward. A delusion of omnipotence takes hold over and against the reality of human vulnerability, precariousness, or dependence, which is eliminated by the expulsion or extermination of those who are assigned neediness as a characterological marker. If this is true, then the very foundational commitment of authoritarian movements is the historically masculinist delusion that the dependency condition can be canceled out. The pitilessness of authoritarian politics, the gleeful cruelty toward the belligerent, the gleeful cruelty or belligerent disregard for the vulnerable is contempt for the dependency condition. And this fosters a very strange relationship to care. A faith in the alignment of the will of the Führer with the laws of history or of nature transforms horizontal relationships of care between the people, making them contingent on a vertical relationship of devotion to the leader or the movement. So horizontally, care is now enacted only in honor of that vertical relation between those who are loyally devoted to the leader or the movement. They find kinship only amongst one another, only insofar as their devotion binds them together, and only as long as no one amongst them stands in the way of the movement or falls out of favor with the leader. Our Kittayan revision of Arendt's account of the undoing of plurality will be founded in the universalization of our understanding of the dependency relation and the consequent universalization and expansion of an ethos of care. The call for a public and political ethics of care constitutes an expansive counter logic to the intensified specification of care, where care is always and only for one's own people, which is mandated by authoritarianism. All right, section 3 is called Aspirational Fascism as an Outcome of Neoliberal Rationality and a Disregard for Public Things under Conditions of Mass Loneliness. So the new authoritarianism emerges in the context of the neoliberalization of global economics. But neoliberalization goes far beyond the economic. As Wendy Brown puts it, neoliberalism is a, quote, governing rationality extending a specific formulation of economic values, practices, and metrics to every dimension of human life. She tells us it bores, quote, capillary fashion into the trunks and branches of workplaces, schools, public agencies, social and political discourse, and above all, the subject. Human existence is reduced to homo economicus, but in its neoliberal form. Brown describes this as an intensely constructed and governed bit of human capital, tasked with improving and leveraging its competitive positioning and with enhancing its portfolio value. Now, this logic is familiar to all of us who work or study in the neoliberalized university. Brown puts it this way: human capital's constant and ubiquitous aim, whether studying, interning, working, planning, retirement, or reinventing itself in a new life, is to entrepreneurialize its endeavors, appreciate its value, and increase its rating or ranking. Sound familiar to anyone? The enhancement of competitive positioning takes place in the context of insecurity. We are tasked with being responsible for ourselves, Brown writes, in a competitive world of other human capitals. We have no guarantee of security, protection, or even survival. A subject construed and constructed as human capital is at persistent risk of failure, redundancy, and abandonment. This jeopardy reaches down to the minimum needs for food or shelter. Now, there are two aspects of neoliberalization I'd like to emphasize here. First, under these conditions, relationships between persons are normalized as brutally uncaring. Competition, not exchange, structures the relation. Second, inequality, not equality, is the normative ideal because the market is formulated in terms of winners and losers. Freedom is relocated from political to economic life and is reduced to the freedom to try to win in a deregulated marketplace. The human person as human capital is freed from any responsibility to others, but the human capital who no longer needs to care is always at risk of falling outside the purview of care. There are no public guarantees, even against hunger or exposure, since neoliberalism wages war on public goods and the very idea of a public. So Arendt says the fascist aspires to, quote, create a society in which the nihilistic banality of homo homini lupus, a man is a wolf to another man, is constantly realized. Bonnie Honig expands on this notion of the erosion of the public in her Arendt-inspired 2017 book, Public Things, where she entertains the idea that democracy might be constitutively dependent on public things, among which she counts things like universities, parks, prisons, schools, roads, the military, government, power plants, utilities, libraries, etc. Public things are sites of attachment and meaning, she argues. They underwrite our collective capacities to imagine, build, and tend to a common world collaboratively. So it's no wonder that our collective capacities to imagine a common world collapse under neoliberal conditions. Overall, what neoliberalization gives rise to is the contemporary form of what Arendt calls mass loneliness. And this was addressed as an American epidemic in publication after publication, even before the pandemic. Quote, isolation and impotence are the preconditions for the rise of totalitarianism, Arendt writes, and ultimately mass loneliness amounts to the collapse of the very intersubjective structure of human existence, so that people feel they do not belong to the world at all. In our time, human capitals exist in more or less brutal social relationships to one another, and their desperation for some sense of belonging primes them for authoritarian capture. Section 4, a Kittayan counter-rationality for resistance to fascism. Are you my brother? In his testimony to the House Select Committee investigating the events of January 6th, Officer Hodges, who was on duty that day, reported that this question was posed to him by one of the insurrectionists at the Capitol. He understood the question immediately as a solicitation, an effort at recruitment, and noted the racialized context of the question. None of the Black officers or other officers of color were solicited in this way by the white crowd. Fascism works to, quote, corrupt all human solidarity, Arendt writes, but it also divides the world between, quote, sworn blood brothers and an indistinct, inarticulate mass of sworn enemies. In a lonely neoliberalized world, humans are desperate to belong somewhere, to have their existence secured by the care of someone. Coupled with the aggrieved entitlement of a white population whose power is fast approaching its expiration date, mass loneliness gives rise to a brutal white nationalist vision of care. Are you my brother? Do you care for me? Will you care for me? Where the vision of care requires cruelty and violence toward all those inarticulate others outside this narrowed, intensified, securitized circle of sameness. Here, the mark of care is racialized violence. The hatred for the other is the symbol of care for the sworn blood brother. Now let's contrast this authoritarian rationality to the call for a public ethic of care in Eva's work. This is the call to recognize the dependency condition as a universal condition of human existence and honor this condition by creating the public institutions and practices that facilitate care. The universalizing comes for Eva with the insight that we are all some mother's child. Here's how Eva articulates the moral mandate to universalize care. We are each a person who has benefited from the care of another, who has been seen as worthy of an investment of care, and attention merely to survive, much less thrive as we grow into adults. If each is worthy of care, then the caregiver too deserves care when she is needy. This is a notion of fairness and reciprocity that is not dyadic, but one that involves an infinite spiral of relationships that reaches both into our past and projects into future generations. It calls for collective social responsibility for care. In 2015, Eva detailed her care-based definition of justice. Justice provides the fair terms of social life given our mutual and inevitable dependency and our inextricable interdependency. She calls for a new social covenant founded on a public recognition of the dependency condition. This is mandated by the acknowledgement that everyone benefits by the caregiver's provision of care, including the larger community. This quote, instantiates an obligation to the caregiver and to an ethos of care more broadly. Quote, the dignity of persons as ends in themselves mandates this moral imperative that vulnerable people be cared for. Eva advocates attention to an investment in what she calls care infrastructure as part of this new social covenant. Her notion of dulia, care and support for the caregiver, is central here, and a respect for dependency work as work is central as well. A public ethic of care should be tied to a host of work-related benefits. Monetary compensation and benefits must be universal, she says. She advocates establishing a national care corps of young persons who spend a part of their youth engaged in caring work. The experience gained by a generation of care corps veterans may help instill social respect for dependency and dependency care, she hopes. And what she calls the most radical proposal is one in which she advocates a system of payment and generous payment at that for all dependency work. This is a public order in which the virtues of care, attention, and responsiveness to the needs of others are seen as virtues of public institutions, where citizens believe that we should be able to care for one another and are not indifferent to the plight of other citizens. She then expands this notion of care beyond national boundaries and to those who are not citizens, noting that a public ethic of care that is state-bound will not be capable of extending that ethic to those whose lives spill over national boundaries. The unfairness that is the outcome of global economic injustices demands the formulation, she writes, of, quote, both a right to be cared for and a right to care on a global level. So I'm suggesting that Eva's proposal for a new social covenant provides a counter rationality or a resistant rationality to the neoliberal rationality that fuels aspirational fascism in our time and saturates every dimension of our social existence. This resistant rationality suggests a way of working against the authoritarian effort to eliminate the promises of natality, worldliness, and plurality by constructing a constricted masculinized relation to the dependency condition. The way of working against the new authoritarianism may not be through direct claims and explicit confrontation. In other words, those seduced by aspirational fascism may not be amenable to the simplicity of facts against the fictionalized world conspirator groups offer them as an antidote to worldlessness. Moral claims for the value of plurality and difference may not gain traction against a frantically reduced and securitized circle which coheres in relation to an authoritarian leader. But working to honor the dependency condition publicly, insisting on its universality, pushing to create or restore the conditions for care accordingly, promoting care as the ethos of public life, putting public resources into a robust care infrastructure, caring for public things may build capillary fashion a resistant counter-rationality to the new authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Eva, the floor is about to be yours, and we've got between now and 1:30 for your response and some Q&A. So if you would go ahead and unmute yourself and maybe provide some feedback and comments for the next 25 minutes or so, and we'll be able to turn it over to everyone for discussion.
Well, I'm a bit overwhelmed. I mean, each of these papers is so complex and has so much to say. And I'm giving here a spontaneous response. And I can't possibly do justice to these papers. I have to first of all thank you all. I mean the whole concept of my being able to benefit my thinking has a contribution to continental philosophy is extremely important to me. And so I want to thank you first of all for this event, and for Gail for making it possible, and all those who make it possible. I've always been sort of on the margins of whatever discipline I've been in, and I think some of the papers really express why. I started out in analytic philosophy. I started out doing work in the philosophy of language. But I didn't come to it from an undergraduate background in analytic philosophy. My undergraduate professor, the one who was most influential in my thinking as an undergraduate, was a Hegelian. And I didn't have a very positive view of analytic philosophy at all as an undergraduate. It so happened that my most interesting graduate professors were analytic philosophers, and so that pulled me in. And what I found myself thinking continually was that the problems that continental philosophers try to grapple with were the ones I wanted to try to grapple with. But I really liked the kind of argumentation that analytic philosophy provided. But I found that in analytic philosophy, even when they undertook a topic that was of interest to me, the form of inquiry resulted in the really interesting aspects of that question just disappearing. And my first work was on metaphor, and metaphor was not being dealt with a lot in philosophy, either in the analytic or in the continental tradition when I started to work on it. But I found that a lot of the work in analytic philosophy that tried to deal with questions of metaphor missed what was really interesting about metaphor. So my dissertation used material from Saussure and from some continental work as well. But as I said, I always found that the attempt to grab hold of a question, and to really explore that question as a question was very appealing. So I always, I think analytic philosophers never really owned me. They never wanted to consider me one of their own. And continental philosophers never wanted to consider me one of their own. So here I am. And And the first question, perhaps, goes to the question of methodology that Ellen brings out. And as I said, I encountered this first in my work in metaphor, but certainly in the work in feminism and sexuality, issues of sexuality, that the Antioch piece brought out. This attempt of putting forward these principles in this, I don't know, in this form of a big block against something that's so delicate and difficult, is what I wanted to counter. And I think, Ellen, you captured that. I have to say that my favorite part of that piece is my title, My Foolish Heart. But the attempt to deal with something as complex as sexuality, as our sexual interactions, is not suited to most of the ways in which analytic philosophy handles it. And I think starting with the personal experience, thinking about sexuality from that point of view, is what one has to do. And then, of course, not just bring in one's own personal experiences, but the experiences much more generally. And that way of doing philosophy, beginning with the personal, seemed to be exactly right for me when I started to think about care ethics. I got interested in care ethics. I had always wanted to do ethics. Ethics was why I had wanted to go into philosophy. But I couldn't stay with the form of analytic inquiry in philosophy, certainly at the time I was doing it. So when Gilligan came to the fore and pronounced this contrast between an ethics of justice and an ethics of care, I don't think anyone really wants to say it's a contrast between justice and care. Care and justice don't need to be antagonists, but they're two different ways of thinking about our moral life. And I found it, again, back in my personal experience. I found that my father was a very principled person and really thought about things in terms of justice. My mother, on the other hand, was an extremely caring person and always formulated questions in terms of care. So I wanted to look at that care question. What was this? Can we say something about an ethics of care that's more than the sentiment of care? Because it seemed to me it was a very profound moral orientation that just hadn't been explored by philosophers anywhere. And the reason for that is quite simple. The people who've been writing philosophy have not been the ones doing the caring. And so that whole aspect of our lives is not captured in the philosophical discourse, whether you turn to analytic philosophy or whether you turn to continental philosophy. And for me, care, of course, was really important as a central part of my life, as Jason was to Joel's family. because it was, you know, it was there, and I had to deal with it, and I wanted to deal with it, and philosophy didn't give me the tools to deal with it. Everyone who's wanted to explore questions of disability had been very disappointed in how little philosophers had to say about disability. And so care and disability intersected for me in a very strong way. And the kind of person that I was caring for, Sesha, was a person that was not represented in any philosophical texts at all. And how could this be, you know? How could philosophers talk about universality when this form of human life wasn't at all considered? So, Joe talked about beginnings and care of Sesha was the beginning for me of a way of trying to look at moral life. And the more you look, the more you see it everywhere. The more you look, the more you see the absence of it in philosophical thought. The more you look, the more you see the absence of it in political thought, in political life. And yet, as Joel and Bonnie so eloquently put it, and so eloquently spoke about it, and so penetratingly spoke about it, our life is pervaded with care and dependency. We don't pay attention to it much of the time. But as one parent with a disabled child said, we're all just walking on the cliff. And we can so easily slip. But that's just not the parents of people with disabled children. That's all of us. That's each and every one of us. It's always there. And it's the thing that is repressed, right? And it comes back to bite us. That repression comes back to bite us in all the ways in which Bonnie talked about, and using the Arendtian framework. And I thank you for that. It's really, really illuminating. I do want to say this, though. When we think about care, because care can be so parochial, and not care in the capital letters, but care in the small letters, we have to always look at it with that danger of pulling it back into the parochial, pulling it back into empathy, as Kate Mann speaks of it. And that's a tension. That's a difficult tension. The other difficult tension is the loss of the singularity into the relationship, right? So we always want to maintain and understand that there's an integrity to each of the individuals in a relationship. And a relationship and a community can never undermine that singularity and individuality. So it's always a dialectic. Care is always in this dialectical relationship to the parochial and the universal, the singular and the relation and the communal. So that one of the other things I wanted to say, and this is in response to some of the last things that Bonnie had to say, I think we have to work on all fronts at once. But I think that in looking at issues of race, in looking at issues of disability, in looking at issues of sexuality, gender, we always need to see how the dependency relationship functions there. You talk, Bonnie, about, let me get back to my notes on your paper. You spoke about the neoliberal, how did you put it? Let's start with the fascist world in which individuals are reduced to a mass. One of the ways in which you see fascism work is, in fact, in the way in which care is appropriated by the fascist state. Right? I think you direct us to this, right? That we're raising the soldiers for the Führer, right? We're raising little Nazis. That's the goal of our care. And those who can't be those Aryan superhumans or whatever, they have to be destroyed. And what we saw in the Nazi regime is that the first who were destroyed were people with mental disabilities. They were the first to be, even before the Jews, they were the ones who were destroyed. So the understanding of the universality of care, the universality of our dependency, is such an important pushback to that kind of fascist appropriation of care. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think I should just stop talking. I just think your papers are so interesting, and I just thank you so much for taking my work much, much, much further than I took it. I look forward to reading them carefully, commenting on them carefully, and to seeing what else you do with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Well, let's go ahead and just open the floor for conversation. I can actually see everybody on my screen. So if you actually raise your physical hand, I will be able to see it. If you want to raise your Zoom hand, that's also fine, especially if you're keeping your video off. The place that you're going to find that, I believe, is under reactions. If you click on the reactions button, the very bottom is the raise hand one. So. Yes, Ed, are you raising your hand?
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Eva, thank you for a very moving statement, and to all three papers for the profound exploration of dimensions of your work that we knew about them, but somehow to articulate them in such force and moral courage by each speaker, I found extraordinary. It was an extraordinary tribute to yourself. My question's rather particular, and so excuse me if it appears that way. I've been very interested in the growth of the attunement of affection, emotion in human beings in early life. This is inspired by the work of Daniel Stern, whom some of you may know, which really has to do with the extraordinary way by which early on, pre-verbally, mainly by gestures and by quasi-mimetic actions, caring, and the critical term of today's session, caring is already happening, but it's happening pre-verbally and at the level of affect itself. Inarticulate, but forceful. And obviously, according to Stern's model, and this is not just Stern's model, but any of us who are parents have experienced this, indispensable to coming to be a caring human being. And so my question to you is rather limited, but I'm interested in whether where you would find a place for what Stern here calls technically affective attunement. I don't think it falls under your critique of empathy that you just mentioned. I think it's more subtle and more complex and interesting than that. And I'm inclined to push it quite far, that it's essential to the care ethic itself, and that without attunement, effective attunement, I mean effective emotional attunement, would get nowhere in the realm of care. So anyway, I just wonder, Eva, if you could respond to that direction of thought.
Of course, that is the central both motivational and just practical way in which one is able to care. One can't care without some sort of attunement of that sort. I don't want to rest everything on emotion, that's all. Because it is possible to care, and care well, actually, without an emotional attachment to an individual. A nurse coming into a patient's room who's never seen the patient before, but who is a truly excellent nurse who is able to attune themselves to that particular situation. They don't need an emotional connection to that individual. But affect does enter into it. Care can't happen without some kind of attitudinal element to it. So yes, it's crucial. Of course, it's crucial to taking care of any individual who doesn't speak, right? Whether you talk about an infant or you talk about folks like Jason and Sasha. I'm assuming, Joel, that Jason couldn't speak. I don't, yeah. Or you're talking to a person who is just in a fever and can't articulate what they're feeling or anything. So one has to do that. One has to be able to attune themselves and get into seeing, well, the way I put it is sort of seeing the world from their perspective. You have to see the world from their perspective and look at the needs that they have from their perspective. And that, I'd say, is also a very anti-fascist move, by the way, Bonnie. it it is giving it is refusing your own authority, as the authority, right? It's always making sure that whatever you think is right for them. It's right as they see it. So emotion, big part of caring, huge part of caring, but it's not the only part of caring. And that's why I don't talk that as much about it, as one might.
Thank you, Eva. That's great. And by the way, I just want to point out that I was a member of the Stony Brook department, which when Eva joined it was flamboyantly, obsessively Continental, I would say. And she found her way, she found her voice. She actually created an alternative way of doing philosophy in that department, which has influenced whole generations, including a number of people who have spoken today directly. And so I just really want to say, Eva, somehow you managed to forge a really unique path in an environment that would have been thought to be, less than attentive to issues that came to preoccupy you. I mean, a good example of that is exactly Joel's reference to Heidegger, who ostensibly has a lot to say about care, but there's no care ethic in Heidegger, and there was no care in his life, as we know, either. But somehow it was an incredible achievement. Talk about singularity, a term that I think really works for the concept of plurality in Arendt. You were a singular human being from the day that you arrived on campus, and it was never the same after that.
We're all singular human beings. We're all singular.
You were especially singular. Let's put it that way.
Well, someone asked another parent about how their disabled actually asked a young child, 10-year-old, I think, about her brother who was very disabled, and said, "What's Joey like?" And she said, Joey is Joey-ish. And that's about right. What is Sesha? She is Sesha-ish.
Yeah.
That focus on singularity is what the non-normate body and contact with persons who are non-normate does for you, because you begin to understand that singularity in a very profound way, and see that it is in fact universal. It's a universal singularity.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any disembodied or embodied hands. However, I also would invite our panelists today to comment on one another or respond back to Eva. Feel free to have a conversation.
Yes, please.
I could say something just about the conversation between Ed and Eva about the question of affect. And I mean, it strikes me that the literature on shared attention is all about, it's all about affect, right? But it's affect in relation to a world, to an object world. And when the parent points out, a toy and says, "Oh, look at this," or when the toddler points to something and then looks back at the parent for some kind of confirmation, the discovery that that's a structure of our entire intersubjective world. That's not just something that happens in infancy. I think it's really important, but it also seems to be necessary for people to develop social cognition, which means the ability to precisely put themselves in someone else's shoes and see something from someone else's point of view. And I think that really links the ethical and the affective dimension, in the sense that I'm thinking when Hannah Arendt wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, one of her claims was that he was absolutely incapable of seeing something from someone else's point of view. So that development of social cognition had somehow failed in his life. And there's a certain social pathology that emerges when that inability to displace oneself from one's own perspective is not overcome through these intersubjective networks that are affected. And then I would just add that I think what's important about Eva insisting that care is not just affect is that the laborious aspect of care is so important, both in terms of how that care work has been for women and unpaid. And there's a whole economic dimension to this discussion of care that falls out when we see it as simply affective. And there's a whole dimension of exploitation that falls out when we see it primarily as affective. So I think holding those together is so important. And I do think you do that because you say certain affective capacities are necessary to be able to care for another person. Care also seems to be what enables affective capacities to develop. But it's also just a ton of work. And I really love the fact that you never sort of sentimentalize that or neglect that aspect.
Well, it's so interesting that in neoliberalism, what did liberalism do? One of the things neoliberalism did was to destroy some of the fragile caring infrastructure existed in many societies, and threw women back into the household, into the privatized household, and that was that's sort of a principal part of neoliberalism, the principal effect anyway of neoliberalism. Another thing that I think is so interesting is that so many totalitarian moves that we see, whether it's in our own country or elsewhere, try to re-privatize care. Right? And they try to re-privatize care by driving women back into the primary role of caregiver of their families. And so pull away from any kind of social responsibility for care. And this is something that's a very potent in all the regressive movements that we see and in the authoritarian movements we see, whether they're religiously oriented or whether they're based on the idea that abortion is a terrible thing. These are all attempts to re-privatize care, and in doing that, undermine the possibility that we have right now, for the first time, really, an opening to with talk of care infrastructure, people trying to actually make the point, and people who are in political positions of power trying to actually make the point that that there is such a thing as a care infrastructure, that the way in which we do care and distribute care responsibilities and pay for care is part of the infrastructure of our society. Huge part, major part. But you haven't heard very much talk about that before. And this is clearly an outcome of the pandemic, where everybody recognized how much care we actually do and how much care we actually need and how precarious our health actually is. And so there you've got both forces, trying to fight each other right now. The ones that actually are trying to bring into reality a more social understanding of the demands of care and how we should be treating it, and trying to get away from the kind of exploitation that caring relationships usually involve, the economic exploitation.
Gail, go ahead.
Thanks for this wonderful session. I really, it's just like Ed, it's just been so moving I feel so moved hearing all of these wonderful commentaries on Eva's work and her response to it. And I was just thinking about, I wanted to maybe return, if we could, to the issue of singularity. I loved what you just said at the end of your remarks to Ed, Eva, about, singularity as the universal. And I was thinking about it in terms of, in contrast, the notion of singularity that you're emphasizing here seems to me very much in contrast with like a Levinasian notion of singularity, where for him, it's the transcendence, it's not the actual face that represents the alterity of the other, but it's some sort of transcendent encounter that we have with the other, versus the kind of singularity you're talking about that comes out of caring for another human being, is so tied to their physical particularity, their affective particularity, right? Those things about them that you bring out so beautifully in the Sesha chapter, in Love's Labor, and also in Brilliant Imperfections. And as anyone who's caring for a young child, I love Shannon's Phoenix postings, Phoenix Rising, that irrepressible personality, and that just that wonderful way in which it's so tied to them as concrete, as embodied individuals. And I think that this notion of singularity is really crucial in terms of thinking about care, the labor of care, the love that goes into care. And so I was sort of reflecting on that and wondering if you'd say a little bit more.
Well, I have to bring it back to Sesha. There really isn't, we now know that Sesha has a syndrome that's shared by others. But even with that shared syndrome, there's no one like Sesha. She is so uniquely herself. And in trying to care for her, if you're not attuned to those singularities, she could die. It's as simple as that. Just the other day, I had a situation where someone left something in her grasp that she could have choked on. So you have to know Sesha of singularity. She can grab things. She will put things in her mouth. You have to know how far she can grab things. You have to know how persistent she is. And you have to know that you cannot tell her to take it out of her mouth. She will not take it out of her mouth because you tell her to take it out of her mouth. And we don't know why. You know, does she not understand it? Can she not coordinate what she understands with what she does? We have no idea. So seeing, you know, it's just seeing close up. You know, it's said that hard cases make bad law. But I think hard cases make good philosophy. Because, I mean, Freud, Ed, you know, of course, Freud, that's where it began, you know, with the supposedly pathological. But with the particular. And there you begin to see aspects of our lives that have the particular configuration they do in that individual. But that's something we find wherever we look, if we look, if we pay attention. And because session needs so much care and paying attention, right? You have to pay attention. So you have to see it. Right? So the extent to which I'm singular is that it's my singular experience here. And, you know, it's also my singular experience. It's not singular, but it's pretty unusual, of being the child of two Holocaust survivors, where I was talking to Rosemary Garland at that trip to Emory that Joan mentioned. And she talked about losing that sense that the world was good and people were good. And I never had that sense. No. To grow up without that innocence to begin with gives you a different perspective too. So I've got, you know, I've got all those singularities in my life, which I think are important to bring to philosophy, you know? I mean, why not bring them to philosophy? These are again parts of the human condition. You know, they're human possibilities. And it's something I'm writing about now. That they're human possibilities that any other human could inhabit. And as soon as you forget that, you know, as soon as you forget that when you see someone all twisted up, you know, looking so strange, that's a human possibility you could inhabit. As soon as you forget that, when you think of Jews or blacks or homosexuals, you know, they're, you know, those other kinds of people. When you forget that's a human possibility you can inhabit, right? That's when we get oppression of various forms, of various sorts. So that's, and so that is why singularity is important, is because you have to understand that each singular life, with all its singularities, is nonetheless a life you could inhabit under different circumstances. And I mean, that has to be the central moral component of our lives. It can't just be, you know, that we can reason. I mean, reason's great. I love reason. But it has to be that you you have a deep understanding, and it's not an understanding from here, it's an understanding from here, that that there isn't an us and a them. As simple as that. There isn't an us and a them.
Eva, I'm recognizing that we only have a few minutes of time left, and you already gave us, well, you talked about the book project that you're working on, Who's Truly Human. Maybe you can give us just a quick snapshot of your next contribution to the world of philosophy, continental or otherwise.
Well, this is the particular paper I'm working on now, and Joel has a very rough draft of it. Yeah, I'm trying to understand what we mean by moral standing or moral status, and then what we understand by personhood. And I'm making a distinction between moral personhood and personhood. Moral personhood I take to be the principal moral equality that we have with one another. And the argument in the paper that I made, that Joe has in his hands, is that if we try to start with a we, which we have to start with in thinking about moral life, but if we think that we is exhaustive, that we can gather from it, and this is in part a response to that dialogue you heard Joel read, what are morally relevant properties? So many of these texts start out with, well, we have full moral status, so what are our relevant moral properties? But that's a very small, that's only a very particular portion of the human race. It's only a very particular portion of the human possibilities that I can inhabit at any time. If I make that list an exclusive list of what constitutes moral status, full moral status, then should I find myself in another condition that's not included in that list, I have argued myself out of moral status. That's a contradiction in practical reason. We can't think about our moral world without looking broadly at human beings. What's possible as a human being? And it has to be a human being, because I can't possibly be a dog. I can share certain things with a dog, and that's very important. And I can understand what's morally important about non-humans from my experience of what is morally important in my human world. That's where we begin. And the more we learn about the non-human world, the more we understand about our moral responsibilities to the non-human world. So that's a position that I'm developing right now. And from there, I want to go on to build a notion of personhood, which is broader and involves the larger moral community. And And I want to build a notion of justice that will incorporate all these possibilities and all the ways in which we can and need to live together, interact together. And also a notion of dignity, a notion of dignity that is not based primarily on our rational capacities, because the times when we both most want to be considered dignified human beings are the times when we're least capable of rationality. We have to have an understanding of what dignity means that that goes beyond, that doesn't depend on our cognitive capacities, but our relational capacities, our relations between one another, and our very fundamental moral status. I don't know how coherent all that is, but that's what I'm working at a snail's pace, may I say. But that's what I'm working at.
Well, thank you for giving us that teaser. We look forward to seeing it in print once Joel gives it back to you with his feedback, right? Well, I want to thank everybody for a wonderful session. I hope that you'll all report back to Gail and other members of the exec team that this was the best virtual session you were at, all SPEP. Don't tell anybody it was the first and only so far, but I give credit to Eva, to Ellen, to Bonnie and Joel for a wonderful session. I wish we could continue the conversation. I know I have to hand it over to Gail, who's going to go ahead and close the session.
Yes.
It's great to see you all, by the way.
Yes. Thanks especially to you, Eva, for just all of your wonderful work and for being here with us today to reflect on your past work and to share that teaser about your current work and future work. We're all indebted to you, and yes, just thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who participated.